are really delighted to welcome Graham Hutchings, who I'm sure many of you know, who's an associate at the University of Oxford China Centre and an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham. He was managing editor at Oxford Analytica, and prior to that, China correspondent of the London's Daily Telegraph, based in Beijing and Hong Kong. And he's the author of Modern China, A Companion to a Rising Power, which was published in 2000. So tonight we're here to celebrate his most recent publication, I think it was in January, isn't that right? Of 1940, the year of revolution, and I should say China before that, but I think everyone knows that. So thank you very much. So I'm going to hand over to you, Graham, and we're already sharing screens, so I think everything looks good, doesn't it?
Terrific. Thank you very much indeed for that generous introduction, Alison, and for the opportunity provided to speak to members of the distinguished society. Thanks also to the IT team and Matty, who put this together. I know that a number of folk who have supported me with wise counsel and advice whilst working on this book have also invested their time in this evening's event, and I'm especially grateful to them, both in the UK and further afield. How can I return a dividend to you for the generosity all of you have shown in giving up part of your Monday evening, if it is evening where you are? Well, I think I can do so in a modest way by emphasizing what a transformative year in a host of respects 1949 was, in terms of China, in terms of the wider world, but in terms of a whole set of issues which take us to the core of a pressing issue in international contemporary geopolitics. And that issue can be best expressed as a question to which I'm afraid I do not have a definitive answer, but which we should, I think, increasingly think about. And it's this: will China take over Taiwan? So 1949 is deep in historical significance, and I'm going to be elaborating some of those significances for you during our time together, but also a pressing issue in the context of the contemporary politics of East Asia. Now, I've made a number of assertions there, and I don't wish you to rely solely on my word for holding them to be true. Let us spend a few moments in the company of Lieutenant Colonel R.V. Drury, who fashioned the words that you see at the bottom of this particular screen, and who did so in his capacity as Assistant Military Attaché based in Beijing in January 1950. He was asked by his masters in London to give a report on 1949, a year which had at that date only just ended. And he said what you see there, and being a military man, he of course added some color with a very strong focus on the battlefront. It's been a particularly significant year, he continued, in the military sphere. Never before has a civil war been waged with so many troops over so vast an area. Over 5 million nationalist and communist soldiers have been engaged, while the victorious armies in many cases have finished up well over 1,000 miles from where they started and have crushed all organized resistance by nationalist forces on the mainland, with the exception of a few armies scattered over West China. Well, he, in keeping with his profession, focused on the military scale of the conflict, and that was indeed remarkable. But it was of even greater significance, 1949, than the Lieutenant Colonel appreciated. It was, for example, an inflection point in China's own history, a history with many inflection points, a country with a history of millennia. And here, 1949 was a very significant one. And I say that because it brought to power Mao Zedong's Communist Party, this year, incidentally, 100 years old, having been formed in July in 1921 in Shanghai, and it began a root and branch reordering of public life. It brought to power a revolutionary movement that was determined to uproot the country's political, social, and economic order and replace it with a new order, to replace it with a new China, strong and socialist, capable of generating wealth, of sponsoring equality, and not least, standing up in the world in a way that would not allow the country to be so affected. Bullying would be the word that the communists use, by the outside powers, the West and Japan in particular. It was also a critical year, 1949, in this context, because it changed the nature of the embryonic Cold War. It brought into the socialist camp, led by the Soviet Union, the most populous country in the world. Broadly speaking, one might say before 1949, with the important exception of the period when it was occupied by Japan, China was in the Western camp, not necessarily of its own volition, but it certainly was. Since 1949, it has never been, despite the dreams of certain Western leaders, remotely in the Western camp. So much for the geopolitics, for the socialist and political dimensions of this year. We need to remember, and I will be dwelling on this as we go through this story together, that this was a tale of tragedy and triumph. It was, above all, a human story, a year of bitter civil war waged across vast swathes of the country. This was a conflict that tore families apart. It was a struggle that sundered friendships. It ruined millions of lives, and it forced hundreds of thousands into exile. Many were inspired by it. They were infused by Mao Zedong and the idea of a new China. Many were dismayed and lost nearly everything they had because of it. Well, we mustn't forget that another dimension of this war, one that is very present with us now, is this, that 1949 created two Chinas. We, on the 1st of October 1949, saw the birth of the People's Republic of China. But that didn't mean the end of the Republic of China, of nationalist China, of China under Chiang Kai-shek. It simply meant, and it wasn't a simple thing, of course, but it simply meant the relocation of the Republic of China, of Chiang Kai-shek's government to Taiwan. Taipei became his capital. So 1949 not only gave us a new China, it gave us two Chinas. And this is very significant for the reasons I've already touched on. China's civil war is unfinished, and there are signs, and have been now for several months, that Beijing may be about to attempt to change that and bring this civil conflict that manifested itself so dramatically in 1949 to something of a conclusion. So what I want to do in our time together is, as it were, to undertake a journey through 1949. I want us to treat the year as if it were a Chinese tapestry, or perhaps a Chinese screen. On a Chinese screen is the title of a rather interesting book by Somerset Maugham, detailing the characters and the circumstances he encountered traveling in China some years before 1949. But I think his image is a good one for us to pursue. I'd like us to stop as we move through this Chinese scroll of 1949 at various events, to meet various individuals, to reflect on certain dramas and dilemmas that are going on. And we shall certainly not lack for those, because we shall encounter personal struggles. We shall get familiar with privations, and we shall also encounter revolutionary commitment and enthusiasm. So let's begin our journey and spend a few moments, first of all, familiarizing ourselves with the two principles in this struggle. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, underneath the picture above of Mao Zedong, who had been, since the 1940s, the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Where do we find them at the beginning of 1949, and what sort of mood are they in at the beginning of our journey through this year? Chiang Kai-shek is in his 62nd year, and he's in Nanyang, his capital. It's a city engulfed in fear and flooded with refugees. He has summoned his civilian party elite, members of the Nationalist Party or the Kuomintang, to a New Year's Eve soiree in his residence. There's fireworks, there's fine food, but none of those things can dispel the sense of undivided gloom. Chiang is reflecting during the course of 1948 on major defeats on every front. In Manchuria, the whole of that northeast region, the industrialized center of China, if you like, has been lost. North China is about to be lost. Indeed, as these folk gather for this reception in Chiang's residence, the sound of artillery fire can be heard from the north bank of the Yangtze. Chiang's wife, Song Mei-ling, has, in November of 1948, gone to the United States in a desperate attempt to get Washington to provide more military aid and advisors. All she got from President Truman was a small amount of tea and a large amount of sympathy. So Chiang has decided, and this is a real surprise to those who are his guests that evening, that he'll have to step down, that he will do so in order for peace talks to take place. He's so distressed by the situation at this juncture that he has forsaken the Methodist principles to which he rather strictly adhered and started taking a nip of whiskey each evening to help him sleep. He tells the astonished gathering that he's going to step down in favor of his vice president, Lee Zhong-ren. As for my own position, he tells them, I have no concerns at all. As long as peace is secured, I will follow the will of the people. Not a small thing for a man who's been in charge of China since 1927, seen it through the war against Japan to make. So what is his calculus? He's playing for time to rebuild his shattered defenses, which have been so badly damaged by the People's Liberation Army. Time, perhaps, despite what Song Mei-ling, his wife, had failed to do in the United States to date, for the US yet to come to his aid. Time also to strengthen the defenses along the Yangtze, that huge river that runs right through the center of China. Perhaps he can hold the line there. And perhaps through peace talks, through negotiations, he might be able to form a coalition government, which would preserve elements of nationalist power, if not his own influence. He's looking for time, too, to transfer key financial resources and other assets out of harm's way. Nanjing is under threat. He needs to get those vital military and other resources into a safe place. And Taiwan is one of those that he has in mind, though at this stage it's not the only one. So much for Chiang Kai-shek, China's recognized leader. Mao is in his 56th year, and he, of course, as you'd expect, given what we know about 1949, finds himself in a very different frame of mind. And what a different situation physically he's in, too. He's in a tiny village in the Taihang mountain range in Hebei, about 200 miles southwest of Beijing. He is surrounded by yellow-baked mud huts, and he's there in simple dwellings surrounded by mountains, set among cypress trees with the key members of his party, Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, his military commander, Zhu De. They are all present, and so is his wife, Jiang Qing. She is not like Jiang's wife out in another country trying to shore up support. By now, the communists are in control of about 1/4 of China and 1/3 of its population. A unified people's government has been set up in North China, and Mao will very soon claim, as a result of those huge victories of 1948 in Manchuria and in North China, that the People's Liberation Army has numerical superiority over Jiang's troops. The war, he said, would therefore end quicker than had been expected. But Mao, despite his revolutionary elan and enthusiasm, warns that victory won't come easily. When Jiang is making this speech offering peace talks to the Chinese public, which he does on January the 1st, and agreeing to step down, Mao is issuing a proclamation which says, "Carry the revolution through to the end." He's castigating the nationalists as gangs of bandits and venomous snakes. The Chinese people must show them no mercy. The revolution must not be abandoned halfway because, as he put it, in that graphic language of which he was so fond, the enemy will not perish of himself. Mao is on the cusp, but he's not yet, as it were, across the line. Let's move away from the key political protagonist for a moment and think about the position of the powers. By the powers, in 1949, as far as China is concerned, we mean the United States, we mean the Soviet Union, and we mean the United Kingdom, because in those days, the UK certainly qualified for that status. What is their take on what is going on? What are their fears and anxieties? What do they see really at risk and in terms of an opportunity as far as the Chinese Civil War is concerned? Well, Washington has a kind of fatal attachment to Chiang Kai-shek. He, as you'll recall, was the wartime leader. He was part of the Allied victory over Nazi Germany and over Imperial Japan. But the Americans knew that he was weak, that his government was corrupt, that he was a poor military leader, that he was very unlikely to win the Civil War. They had a lot at stake, but most American policymakers, including those in China, felt that an even greater risk would be to back a government which, in their view, had so plainly lost the support of the Chinese people. And yet he was too important to completely abandon. The Americans were not ready to recognize Mao Zedong's new government. That was a step too far for them for the time being. So they were caught in a dilemma. Jiang is too weak to support, too discredited to back, but he's too important to abandon. In Moscow, we see a different perspective unfolding. And here is Uncle Joe Stalin, the man who led his country after the enormous privations of the Second World War into a position of unrivaled strategic significance with the victory over the Nazis and over Japan. His country, I suppose you'd say, along with the United States, was the supreme victor as far as that great conflict is concerned. The Soviet Union has been sporting Mao for some time. Indeed, it was the Soviet Union's emissaries that in 1921 played a very important part in creating the Chinese Communist Party. And then for all the tortuous travails of the Chinese Party that followed, the Soviet Union was there in one sense or another, providing ideological advice, providing weapons, providing money, providing strategy. But Stalin now, in 1949, is getting a little bit anxious about Mao. Of course, he's pleased that the revolution is making such headway and that China, this huge country, will still go red. And Mao Zedong was second to none in his general admiration for Stalin. And he made that plain. He would do so even more so once he had seized power in 1949. But Stalin, it has been famously said, trusted no one, including his mother or God. And he certainly didn't trust Mao Zedong, or at least he didn't trust him completely. This quotation here reflects that distrust and skepticism. Who is this man, Mao Zedong? What kind of socialist could he be? Remember, the route to communist victory was taken, by orthodoxy at least, to be through the organized industrial workers and their political representatives, the proletariat. And yet here was this man who had come to power on the back of a peasant revolution. So it occurred to Stalin, it seems, even at this early juncture, that Mao could be something of a headache. If he had brought communism to China, or socialism, let's not argue too much about those terms in this context, might he not also aspire to leadership of the socialist camp? As far as Stalin was concerned, a communist-controlled China could be something of a mixed blessing. Well, finally, how does the situation seem from London? Well, the UK government, and you'll recall now that this is the Labour government, the reforming, quite radical Labour government elected in 1945, coming to the end of its first term. It doesn't have direct skin in the game in the sense that it backs Jiang or it supports Mao. Of course, it is not a friend of the communist camp, but it has other more practical considerations in mind. It wants to keep, as Ernest Bevin, the man shown on the left here, the rather able foreign secretary, a foot in the door in China. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means really the protection of Britain's very considerable commercial stake in China, built up during the previous century and centered in Shanghai. The British government was not in any sense forthcoming in its support for Jiang, but it hoped a communist government, since it was likely to come to power, would respond favorably to overtures and allow British interest to flourish in the major cities and Shanghai in particular. Of course, a considerable issue at stake also for the British was Hong Kong, then less significant than Shanghai as a center of commercial enterprise, but nonetheless a very important foothold on maritime China that Britain had had for the past century. And beyond Hong Kong, there was the question of the empire as a whole. It's often said that the Labour government was no friend of the empire, it didn't much, well, I never put that another way, it was no friend of imperialism, but it was rather fond of the empire, and it was concerned about Malaya in particular, and Singapore, where ethnic Chinese were very significant features of the political landscape and might be expected to respond in ways that the imperial power would not like to a communist revolution in China. So much for diplomacy and statecraft, for the issues and dilemmas that were apparent in the early part of 1949. Let's return to China and think a little bit about Jiang's camp. We said earlier that Jiang had decided to resign. He would step down in favor of his vice president, the man on the left here, whose name was Li Zongren. Li Zongren was in close partnership, had been for many years, with the man on the right, Bai Chongxi. They both came from Guangxi in southwest China. They both worked together very successfully, building up a sense of independent power and autonomy. It was dangerous, Jiang knew, to hand over to Li Zongren, not only because Li had opposed him so often in the past and might make a deal with the communists, but because Bai Chongxi was the now most formidable military commander left on the nationalist side, on the government side. And if his troops threw in the towel, or if his troops were defeated, then so would Jiang's cause. And so the rivalry, long-standing, between the Guangxi faction of the Kuomintang, between Li and Bai, and Chiang Kai-shek's central government, continued throughout 1949 and severely debilitated the nationalist government's military efforts to stop the communist advance. It is a story, in other words, within a story. Jiang's house was divided and there were disastrous consequences. We mentioned Bai Chongxi. By the early part of 1949, here's a different picture of him on the right. He's sitting in Wuhan, pretty well smack bang in the center of China. He is the commander of Jiang's central command, designed to crush or at least prevent any communist attempt to cross the Yangtze in that particular region. Getting close to him on the opposite side is Mao's best general, Lin Biao. Lin Biao is the man who had won for Mao the extraordinary victory in Manchuria. He had moved south in the weeks that followed and was sitting pretty well opposite Bai. He, by now, had some 650 or 700,000 troops, whereas Bai had only 500,000, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 of which were good troops. These men had an interesting backstory and they had form as rivals. Lin Biao was between 41 and 42, affable, self-assured on the surface, but in fact nervous and highly strung. He'd always been more interested in revolution than any kind of education. And the curriculum at the various schools that he attended was essentially an irrelevance to him. He was a committed communist by the time he was the age of 18, and he would play an important role in every stage of the Chinese Communist Party's history, apart from the very beginning until his own death in 1971. Bai Chongxi is made from similar stuff, but he's a little bit older. He's 56, 57. He joined the youth army in 1911 when the Manchu Qing dynasty was overthrown, and he marched north to Wuhan, where he now sits, an older man in charge of the Central China Command. His concern was to support the Republican Revolution. He was ultimately and completely loyal to the nationalist cause, to the Kuomintang cause, and he played a major role in stopping and stalling the Japanese advances into China in the 1930s and 1940s. Well, these two guys had found their forces ranged against each other in 1946 as the Civil War was unfolded. And on that occasion, up there in Manchuria, where they clashed, Bai got the upper hand. He was then Minister of Defense. Now, however, the situation is very much reversed. And the story of 1949 is that of the extinguishing of Bai Chongxi's career from being a prominent figure, not only in nationalist history, but in China's military history, into a man whose political and military capital is completely exhausted, because Lin Biao forces Bai ever further south during the course of 1949. And he destroys Bai's armies in their home province of Guangxi. And Bai is forced to move to Hainan Island, that island that sits in the Gulf down there in the southwest, close to the border with Vietnam. For a while, Bai Chongxi's headquarters is a deserted Roman Catholic church on the island. His career is finished. A broken man at the end of 1949, he had to flee to Taiwan himself. We said earlier that this is a story about people, not just politicians, diplomatists, and strategists, and it is about people fleeing. The quotation you see here is from Lester Knox Little, an American national who was head of China's Maritime Customs Service. This was the institution set up in the 19th century to collect China's revenues arising from imports. And it was staffed, not overwhelmingly in later years, but very significantly and always at its head by a foreign national. Lester Knox Little was an American, and he was the last to perform that role. In his diary, we find him making the comment that you see there. It struck me as an odd comment to make. After all, China was in the midst of a civil war, but he himself, that is Lester Knox Little, was in flight. He fled from Shanghai to avoid communism to Guangzhou, Canton. He fled from Canton to avoid communism to Hong Kong and thence to Taipei, where he finally retired. And of course, he wasn't the only one fleeing, trying to get away from conflict, trying to avoid communism. For all that many people didn't really understand what communism was, that very uncertainty was enough. If they had any assets to protect, if they wanted to, as they thought, follow the best interest of their family, they fled. The roads were crowded. Buses and trains were full. Ships, likewise. Such aircraft that were available to civilians were full, not only with people, but with items of furniture and personal possessions. We perhaps ought to spend just a few moments in the company of a couple of people who fled in the way that we describe. The lady shown on the bottom left of your screen is a woman called Mae Jun, and her husband was in Jiang's military. She lived in Zhejiang in prosperous southeast China, relatively speaking, but decided at the age of 24 that she needed to link up with her husband, who was serving in a different part of the country, and get out of harm's way. And so in January 1949, with her son strapped to her back, he was a babe in arms, she simply tells her mother she will be back soon and leaves the village. She embarks on a 15-month journey, backwards and forwards across South China. She heads first for where she thinks her husband will be based, takes a crowded train, and moves south for imagined safety. She gets off in Henyang in Hunan province and leaves her tiny son in her mother-in-law's care there and heads south for Guangzhou. These are huge journeys at any time and in any circumstances, and they're conducted, of course, in great uncertainty. She links up with her husband in Guangzhou, but she sees that this city, too, is filling up with refugees, civilian and defeated soldiers. She feels she has to go north again and collect her son and then try and go south and save him. So she's moving north in September 1949 against the great flow of people. That flow is from the interior to the exterior, from the countryside to the cities, and where possible, out into the maritime parts of China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and further afield. She gets north again and finds a crowded train, which she, and with her son, tries to board, but her mother, seeing the press of people and the risk to her grandson, says, "Wouldn't it be better to leave the child with me?" Mae Jun reluctantly agrees, and her escort thrusts her through the carriage window, as she recorded, as if I was a piece of freight. She works her way south, staying ahead of the advancing communist armies, and like Bai Chongxi, whom we referred to earlier, also ends up in Hainan, but she doesn't get out in December 1949 like he did. He was able to fly out, having the privileges available to him as a senior member of Jiang's army. Mae Jun has to leave on a troop ship. She does so in March 1950, which is bound for Taiwan. She described the scene as she boarded at the crowded harbor. People pulled themselves up ladders to get over the ship's rails and into the boats like so many spiders, she said. Cries of help went up. Many could not make it to the ship, but no one paid any attention. Cotton shoes bobbed up and down in the harbor. Wounded soldiers who protected our retreat lay on the dockside crying in pain. Those on board the ships could look back helplessly, abandoning them to their fate. Let's spend just a few moments with another man's plight. I say man because he wasn't a man at the time, but a school child, and that is a man who later became known as Ya Xian, a poet. In November 1948, we find Ya in middle school in central China. The fighting has intruded and caused a lot of damage and is threatening the city. Ya Xian's teachers, with the consent of the parents, decide they must move the students south. They must head for a safer place. They must educate them on the way, as long as they can do that, perhaps by stopping in temples and other places en route. Ya Xian recalled, we students didn't really understand what was going on. It seemed like fun at the time. We were asked to congregate in the square. I had no idea what the idea of goodbye or farewell meant. It was an alien concept to me. My grandfather came to see me off, but I didn't even acknowledge him. We just marched following our teachers. I was alone, independent. That was the last contact I ever had with my family. By the late summer, Ya Xian and the hundreds of students from the province of Henan, where they had been, were found in Hunan. Again, that's where Mae Jun had hoped to drop off her son. They were pondering, with their teacher's advice, where they would go next as the PLA was pressing ever closer. It was at that point that Ya Xian and a couple of his close friends saw a recruitment notice pinned to a town wall. It was a recruitment notice for a new army that Sun Li-ren, a rather able nationalist general, was raising in Taiwan. A rapid program of recruitment and then promotion was offered. And so Ya Xian and a few of his friends decided to peel off from that school exodus, moved to Guangzhou, and joined in Taipei, the Taipei being the capital of Taiwan, the new Sun Li-ren army. We've spoken about the PLA pressing south. Let's return to the battlefront for a few moments and think about the crossing of the Yangtze. Crossing the Yangtze was for Mao Zedong and the Communist High Command something that they were determined to do. Whether Jiang negotiated a deal, a surrender, whatever it might be, they were going to cross. And history shows that unless a northern government controls the rich Yangtze Valley and the provinces to the south, it is forever at the mercy of the south. Unification had to be complete. And recall that Mao Zedong wasn't just after the seizure of power for its own sake. As attractive as that was, he was determined to make a revolution. The Yangtze, according to some defense officials on the government side, was worth about 300,000 soldiers. Such a formidable obstacle was it to crossing by an army from north to south. And here you see an interesting piece of doggerel. The PLA had been on the North Bank before they crossed in April 1949 for several weeks. The PLA was composed largely of northern soldiers, and the Yangtze not only is a physical barrier, a formidable one in the geographical sense, but it marks the division between two cultural worlds, different language, different cuisine, different topography, different weather. And so there was this rhyme or doggerel going around, even amongst the apparently loyal revolutionary-minded soldiers of the Red Army from the north. They were not at all enamored with the idea of crossing the river, or at least dealing with what they would find on the other side. In the event, that apprehension quickly melted away, because 5 p.m. On April the 21st, the communist artillery opened up, and an armada of tiny boats that had been corralled and hidden away for several weeks emerged, carrying the army across the Yangtze in the places indicated on this map. Time magazine told its worldwide readers of a stunning, swift disaster in China. Nearly 1 million communist troops along a 400-mile front poured across the Yangtze, Nationalist China's last great defensive barrier. It swept the government aside like puny earthworks in a raging tide. The communists moved with impressive speed. In 4 days, they took Nanyang, cut off Shanghai, and captured half a dozen strategic nationalist cities. I'd like to add a little codicil to this section on the Yangtze, and that is to do with the frigate, the HMS Amethyst. I think the Amethyst incident is sufficiently well known for me not to go into it in any great detail, but this was essentially a naval vessel, for reasons that still haven't been fully explained other than incompetence, was sent up from Shanghai to Nanjing right at that precise moment when the communists were preparing to cross the river. It was caught in crossfire, it was very badly damaged, and it was laid up in the middle stretches of the Yangtze for several weeks. There was significant loss amongst the ship's company. It's pretty plain that the communists opened fire on this first. Successive rescue missions, both by sea and by a Sunderland flying boat from Hong Kong, failed. And it wasn't until the end of July that the HMS Amethyst managed to sail under cover of night down to Shanghai and out into the Pacific. And with that characteristic perfidy, if that's the right word, that the British have made their own, a military disaster was turned into a national triumph. But the PLA is now across the Yangtze. But you need more than just an army to conduct a revolution. You need committed cadres or officials to actually make the revolution work. When Deng Xiaoping in 1948, that's a name Deng Xiaoping I know that will be familiar to you, in August 1948 says, if we're going to take over South China, which we most definitely are, we will need at least 40,000 cadres for every 100 million people we rule. And by cadres, he meant people who not necessarily were Communist Party members, but were advocates and enthusiasts for the communist cause. No surprise that these, in many cases, were young people, people who wanted China to change, people who were inspired by the new opportunity for China to stand tall and to deal with corruption, to deal with inequalities that had so blighted their lives. The southbound cadres followed the army. They were there to prepare for land reform. They were there to get ready to take over the cities. They were mostly northerners moving south. And to the extent that they gained power and built roots in South China, that changed the pattern of alliance in China too, where there was a very strong provincial identity. What happened in 1949 was that those identities and those loyalties were changed as a result of the revolution and the movement of the southbound cadres. The regulations for these groups were interesting. They were issued according to the regs with one suit of clothes, one pair of shoes for the journey south. Those above a certain rank could take with them an ox, one horse, and a rider, while those at another level could, when traveling in a group of 40, hire a truck to carry their belongings. Anyone who owned a bicycle and in those days, of course, that was quite a luxury, was welcome to take it with them, but there was no question of the party paying for repairs. What the southbound cadres did was very important in preparing the way for land reform. And here we find one of the principal incentives, particularly, of course, amongst the farmers, for backing Mao's cause. The civil war in China was fought between peasant armies, but only one of them, the People's Liberation Army, was promised, after the war had ended, the realistic prospect of owning land rather than paying rent to a landlord and borrowing money from a usurer to tend one's crops and buy what was necessary to get to the harvest. So Mao's army, and I'm speaking in generalizations here, had an enormous lot at stake, whereas the nationalists were promised very little by comparison should they win. What the army had to do, what the party indeed had to do at this stage in 1949, was convert itself from an instrument of rural insurrection, which it had been for the previous 30 years or so, into a cadre of people who could not only occupy the cities, but could also run them. Here are the cities that were taken during the course of 1949. And it allows us to make some general remarks about the way in which the communists, peasant men and women, largely uneducated, were able to run sophisticated modern cities, home to significant centers of the population, but a minority, of course, as far as the total population is concerned. In only one major city in 1949 was there protracted fighting between the two sides for control, and that was the first of these, Taipei, the provincial capital of Shanxi. And the nationalist leader here was not Chiang Kai-shek, but a man called Yan Xishan, who had been operating there for decades and had loyal support. His troops had nowhere really to go, and so they fought to the end. But in the other centers, Nanyang, Shanghai, Hangzhou, Wuhan, the list goes on, there was very little fighting, other than skirmishes in the suburbs, largely as a result of rearguard actions carried out by Chiang Kai-shek. Similarly, however, we ought to note that in none of these cities were there premature uprisings by the population saying, we've had enough of the government, we want the communists to come in. We should also note that once the communists had got those cities, they never lost them again, and there were no significant attempts by Chiang Kai-shek to recover them. Talking about Shanghai, as we have, of course, we're dealing with China's most prosperous, most global, most connected city in the late 1940s, a center for business, manufacturing, international influence. So the arrival, the approach indeed of Mao's communist armies was a real problem for someone like Liu Hongshan, who was a domestic Chinese entrepreneur of considerable stature and significance. He had been worrying for some time about communism and what it would mean for his business. He was 60 years of age. He dominated the textile, the cement, the match industry, and much else. In mid-1948, he decided that he'd move some assets to Taipei. He saw that Chiang Kai-shek was interested in Taipei, but he also saw Chiang Kai-shek's efforts at currency reform and the shambles that was economic mismanagement in Shanghai, and decided that he wouldn't invest a lot in Chiang Kai-shek and his government. Taiwan will not be a safe place for our enterprise, he told his children at a family meeting. In April and May, as the communists moved into Shanghai, he received messages from one of his sons, who, unbeknown to him, had joined the Chinese Communist Party secretly, that things were going to be good for business under communism in Shanghai, and he urged his dad to remain. Dad wouldn't listen. He moved instead to Hong Kong, where he would spend the the next few months. He stayed there despite the imprecations of his family, of his wife, of his mistress, and of others urging him to go from Hong Kong back to Shanghai, by now under communism. Things are going to be good here. We've got rid of the corruption. There is a bright future for business. He, in the event, finally began to listen to them and also to Zhou Enlai, who reached out to him. Zhou knew how valuable it would be to get Liu Hongshang out of Hong Kong back into Shanghai. I'm an old man already, he replied to Zhou's requests. All of my enterprises are in China. I'll go back and I'll not stay abroad as a white Chinese. So at the end of 1949, Liu returns to Shanghai in a clandestine fashion so as to stop nationalist agents preventing his return. He returns to Shanghai and lends his support to the regime. And that works reasonably well for a few years until the mid-1950s, when his assets are expropriated, his business is nationalized. We're coming to the end of our journey, and one of the penultimate stops we must make is in Tiananmen Square on the 1st of October. This is when Mao Zedong declared the foundation of the People's Republic of China. Here is one of the key aspects of 1949 as far as its legacy and its significance is concerned, because we see here announced and unfolded in the weeks and months that follow some of the principal features of the architecture, the nature, the temperament of Chinese politics that persists to this very day. Mao has announced before the 1st of October that China is going to be ruled by a people's democratic dictatorship. The people, in his mind, are those who support the Chinese Communist Party. They are going to benefit from democracy, as he puts it. The dictatorship is exercised over the others, meaning the landlords, meaning the nationalists, meaning those people who support the old order and do not like the new. What immediately happens with the creation of the People's Republic of China is that Chinese everywhere under its jurisdiction attend meetings on a scale that they have never done before. Meetings are a feature of contemporary China and indeed have been stepped up under its present leader of Xi Jinping to inculcate the message, to ensure loyalty. There's a reshaping going on of minds and mentalities. What Mao's also said is that China is going to lean to one side. It's going to support the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is the first country to recognize the People's Republic of China on the 1st or 2nd of October. The new institutions that are set up are, broadly speaking, those that are still with us, as is the language. There's genuine enthusiasm amongst many for this revolutionary cause, but there is enormous psychological pressure to conform, and soon there will be significant punishments for those who do not. We're coming to the end of our story. I don't feel we can do so without thinking for a few moments about Hong Kong. The British have been sitting there in 1949, wondering and worrying about the impact of the communist victory on their possession of Hong Kong. Will the communists march straight across the border and take the colony back? They've given no indication of doing so. They have not made the liberation, as they put it, of Hong Kong part of their program, but nobody could be quite sure. And what happened to HMS Amethyst, shot up in the Yangtze in April 1927, April 1949, was a certain indicator that the communists were A, not afraid of foreigners, and B, were going to reorder their presence on Chinese soil in a very significant way. What Alexander Grantham, shown on the left, decided to do, in conjunction with the government, of course, in London, was to reinforce Hong Kong in a very significant way. Land troops were moved in, the army. The Air Force was strengthened. A Royal Navy flotilla, including an aircraft carrier, was moved close by. The idea was not to imagine that a PLA invasion could be resisted, but to raise the bar, to show some deterrent effect, to show that British were determined to remain in Hong Kong. In the event, the People's Liberation Army did stop at the border. And here you see an irregular PLA paramilitary man and a tall, rather nattily dressed in his shorts, British policeman meeting on the frontier. London then decided we must stay in Hong Kong. Given the nature of the Cold War generally, we are now finding ourselves with a Cold War frontier at Hong Kong. Bevin called Hong Kong the Berlin of the East, and in Parliament, Harold Macmillan used the analogy of Gibraltar. Britain had to hold on. And it did, of course, as we well know, until 1997. And until a couple of years ago or so, Hong Kong, you could say, remained essentially unaltered in its political landscape from the time of 1949 right through to 2 or 3 years ago. So our journey ends in Taiwan. What Chiang Kai-shek has been doing since he retired all those months ago is building up resources in Taiwan. He liked the idea of Taiwan, didn't have it in mind right from the get-go as the place where his government would form a final bastion. He'd hoped to build resistance elsewhere in South or Southwest China, but that proved impossible. Taiwan had the advantage of being an island. It had the advantage of being under Japanese rule until 1945, quite a prosperous part of China. It had the considerable advantage of having no indigenous communist movement. There was 100 miles of sea separating it from the mainland. Of course, there were enormous problems. Refugees had flooded in, both civilian and military. Taiwan used to do trade, most of it indeed, with the mainland. That was no longer possible. The island reoriented itself, doing more trade with Japan and Southeast Asia. It was under martial law from the middle of the year. It was the receptacle, if you like, for the art treasures that Chiang moved there, the gold and bullion and foreign exchange reserves that he moved there so that he could fight another day. You might wonder why he moved the art and cultural treasures of China from the mainland museums to Taipei. Well, he did so not just because he was an art lover, indeed he may not have been much of an art lover at all, but because it was to do with legitimacy. As we all know, China is the inheritor of an extraordinarily accomplished civilizational heritage. And the government that could claim to be in possession of that could claim to be the custodian of that, would, in his view, and rightly so, I think, be accorded greater legitimacy. And so we find a kind of standoff at the end of 1949, but a standoff that looks as though it will be decided, like the fate of mainland China, in favor of the PLA. And at the end of the year, beginning of 1950, the PLA is indeed preparing an amphibious assault on Taiwan. And the Americans and other observers felt sure it was only a matter of time before Chiang Kai-shek was expelled from Taiwan too, and his government would finally collapse. What saved it, of course, were events not so much in China, but in North Korea. The outbreak of the Korean War in the middle of 1949, the participation of Chinese communist troops in that conflict under Stalin's prompting and with Mao's approval, told the Americans that it was no good having a completely hands-off policy as far as Chiang Kai-shek and Taiwan was concerned. It was necessary, on the contrary, to regard that island as a key part of the defense of East Asia. And that's the situation that prevails until this very day. Taiwan is sitting there. The mainland has been under communist rule for 70 years, and a big item on Beijing's agenda, especially under its present president and party secretary Xi Jinping, has been unfulfilled. The liberation of Taiwan, or more neutrally, national unification. And I think it's interesting from a historical perspective to note that we are dealing, in the case of China, with a power of global standing that has yet to go through the process of national unification. Very different from the situation with regard, for example, to previous global powers, like the United Kingdom, which made its mark on global affairs when it was a United Kingdom of various nationalities, the Irish accepted, of the United States, which grew to global stature after the Civil War, and the same, of course, with regard to Germany and Italy. China's reunification is not yet complete. And Xi Jinping has warned that this cannot be left indefinitely. It's a matter of utmost consequence. It's a matter that affects not just 25 million Taiwanese people, who aren't going to be likely to have much of a say other than in the respect that they can mount a military defense, but touches upon the interests of the whole neighborhood, of Japan, of Korea, of Southeast Asia, and of course, of the United States. And so we find ourselves dealing with this dilemma of what next across the Taiwan Straits, a dilemma rooted in history, a dilemma rich in human consequence and in human experience, and above all, a dilemma, ladies and gentlemen, that had its origins in this tempestuous year of 1949. Well, that's where I end my journey. Thank you so much for accompanying me along it. I am most happy to answer any questions, and if I can, deal with any challenges and other objections you might make to some of the points that I've shared with you. So perhaps back to Alison at this point.
All right, thank you very much, Graham, for taking us on that journey, which was very, very interesting. And I'm just wondering, do you want to unshare your screen?
Yes.
Just so that we can revert back. And I'm just going to ask if anyone would like any questions, but to ask any questions. I will just sort of kick off with one, if that's all right. I was wondering, how imminent do you think this problem between China and Taiwan is at the moment? I mean, is it? I think you seem to suggest that it's let's say, pretty much on the edge.
Yes. Well, I think it is on the edge, but we perhaps ought to be very careful when we talk about timing, because that expression on the edge rather suggests that it could be accomplished by Wednesday afternoon. And I don't think it's going to be this Wednesday or next Wednesday. Recall that we have been dealing with this situation since 1949, and that there have been significant and severe Taiwan Straits crises in the 1950s, when shots were fired in anger, and there were periods when it seemed likely to lead to a wider conflagration. But bear in mind also that Xi Jinping, China's present ruler, who has done so much to change China in a number of respects, is a man as he would regard it, of destiny. Recall also that in the last couple of years, and Xi Jinping is very much a factor here, has trying to impose its rule in Hong Kong in a way that it had not done in that period since the transfer of sovereignty in 1997 up until, say, 2017, 2018. The military balance is strongly, very strongly tilted towards the mainland, and the growing understanding, as far as one can make out, amongst the political and military elite in Beijing is concerned, is that the United States is weak, would not be able to rally to the Taiwan cause very quickly and possibly not very effectively. And so the island could be brought to its knees more easily than at any time for a long time. So those are some of the calculations that I think it's right to say would be going through certain minds in Beijing. Now, that doesn't mean, as I indicated right at the beginning of my answer, that it's going to be in the next week or the next year, but the direction of travel, it seems clear to me. And the final point I'd make is that it might not be necessary, given the nature of contemporary warfare, to mount a huge armada of the kind, for example, they were planning in 1950, or the kind that got the PLA across the Yangtze in very different circumstances in 1949. The island could be brought to heel by other measures involving cybersecurity and other tricks and tools available to the aggressor. All these things suggest, perhaps, that the day is getting near, and the communists feel the task might be getting easier.
Thank you. I have a question on the chat. Lin Biao, what's the after story?
The after story with Lin Biao is one of great drama. We contrasted Lin Biao with Bai Chongxi, whose career ended in 1949. He was forced to retreat to Taipei, where Chiang Kai-shek still didn't trust him. He was stripped of power. He lived comfortably, but it was the tragic end of a national career. Lin Biao went from strength to strength and then suddenly met his demise. So in short, he declined to take a significant role in the Korean War, but took a very big one in Mao's Cultural Revolution, a domestic upheaval that began in 1966. And if ever you see Lin Biao, in common with other Chinese leaders, holding up Mao Zedong's little red book as a sign of fealty and loyalty, you will often see that he has his finger inserted within the pages of the book, unlike others who seem to hold it by the covers. And that is thought to reflect the fact that he had got to a certain stage in reading that book, and he was particularly fond of it. In other words, it was a sign of extra devotion. But he too decided that Mao was going to turn on him, and that a preemptive strike to prevent that was necessary. And that seemed to involve a coup that he orchestrated. When that was discovered, and Mao was literally, metaphorically perhaps, rather than literally breathing down his neck, he boarded a flight, a Trident plane no less, which crashed in Mongolia, where he was believed to be en route to the Soviet Union. So if you think about the end of career of Bai Chongxi and Lin Biao, that happened in 1971 with Lin, I think you'd probably choose Bai Chongxi.
Okay. Right. Well, I have another question here. What prompted you to use the stories of Ya Xian and Mae Jun in your book?
I found that there was a growing literature that dealt with the human side of the Civil War, and that Mae Jun's daughter was a principal figure in that literature. She, in a couple of books, had collected stories, done a lot of interviews of by now elderly people. And there was a wide range of choice, both in her work and others that I could have chosen. But these seem to me to be both interesting and dramatic in themselves, and sufficiently different in that one was a school child, one was a peasant woman from a village. They provided different perspectives and different dimensions of this dramatic story.
Okay, thank you. And I just wonder what you think of how is the year 1949 understood by the younger generation in China today? I mean, does it have that same significance that you know, we could put to it?
It certainly does, because it's part of the founding myth, if we can use that term, story of China. 1949 is, in official communist orthodoxy, and to some extent in reality, as I've tried to explain, a fundamental dividing line. It's the dividing line between the old China and the new China. It's part of that constitutive story that every nation has about itself in a different kind of way, and I emphasize the difference. It's the 1066 or the 1815 story in the history of England, only it's invested with much more political purpose. It's much more recent. Now, I want to say that the year 1949, for all that I've spent the last hour and more telling you about it, is to some extent artificial. It's the same Chinese people, it's the same China, it's the same geographical space, and historians have rightly pointed out the continuities between before and after, the long-term trends that exist. But I don't find that these two views are incompatible. I don't find that they are contradictory. It was a revolutionary year, a year that gave us the China that we now have. The China that we now have also, naturally enough, consists of trends, developments, and issues that predated 1949. So I can live quite happily with that contradiction.
Right. I don't know if anyone has any other questions, but oh yes, Neil, I will unmute you so you can speak. All right. Sorry, I'll just, can you unmute?
We can't hear you, Neil. You need to unmute yourself. That's it.
Yeah.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes,
are.
you are.
Hello, Graham. So nice to see you.
And you, Neil.
And thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Even though I've been studying you for many years, as you know. Graham, my question is modern day. The issue of Hong Kong and what is taking place between China and Hong Kong. My question is really around Hong Kong being an international financial center. And other than Hong Kong, my belief is that China does not have at present an international financial center. It has Shanghai, but that is not an international financial center. And with the uncertainty of the future of Hong Kong and the exit of many people from Hong Kong that are people of worth, people of influence, what will China eventually do to establish Hong Kong or elsewhere as its international financial center that is stable?
Well, it's a great question, as I knew it would be coming from you, Neil. Let me say this in response, that your idea of an international financial center, which I think is a widely accepted one, and broadly across the world is so, need not be the same as China's idea of an international financial center. It's no part of their bargain that the price of having a financial center and genuine international financial center should be that you have demonstrations complaining, protesting about communist rule, challenging the very principle of the People's Republic of China and appearing to invite foreign intervention to thwart that. I'm not saying that that perception is correct, but I'm saying that that is how it is seen. For that period until 2 or 3 years ago, following the transfer of sovereignty, things were broadly speaking well managed. Hong Kong got what it wants in terms of its autonomy, and Beijing could live with the irritants that it encountered there. But the deal's been upset. It's been upset by the presence of new arrival on the scene of Xi Jinping and his determination to ensure that control trumps autonomy. And if the cost, the price of that is the flight of Hong Kong people, well, do you know what? There are plenty of people in the mainland who'd like to move down into Hong Kong. There are plenty of companies in the mainland that would like to do that. And if there is squeals and complaints from the international financial community, from global companies, well, let's see how long they squeal. Let's see how long they complain. Let's see how ready they are to disinvest from China. Our calculation, I think they're saying in Beijing, to oversimplify, is that we hold the cards. We may suffer some reputational issues, but nothing is so important as maintaining control. Everything must come after that, and we're too big and we're growing too fast for there to be really serious economic consequences. It's a bit of a bleak answer, but that's how I think they see it.
Very good. I would agree that China has more to gain and less to lose, and it does not worry about what the world may say. It'll just bear through that.
Yeah.
Is there any uprising regarding the South China Seas at all now that they have seized all of the islands and built it there? Is there any backlash?
Well, there's a lot of discontent and unhappiness about it in Hanoi, in Taipei, in Japan in respect of the East China Sea, probably to some extent in Malaysia and some unease in Singapore. But when you consider the ways in which the Chinese military have been able to establish themselves in extraordinarily rapid time in those islets and shoals, when you consider the way in which they're rapidly building up the aerial and naval forces to police those areas, what can those countries do apart from squeal? I should have mentioned the Philippines, of course, being very unhappy as well. But the tanks, I know this is the completely wrong analogy, but allow me to pursue it, if you will. The tanks are parked on the lawn, or the bases, the airstrips, and the flotillas are already there. So it's a question of living with it.
Right. If we have no more questions.
I see there's one up there, Alison. Somebody just texted in.
Sorry, yes. Oh, sorry. This is from
it's about Xi.
Xi, yes. Do you think Xi would wait to take Taiwan up till after the CCP has consolidated its position in Hong Kong?
There is, I think, quite a lot of merit in that argument. we are dealing with events and circumstances which by definition are not always in our control, and even within the control of the Chinese Communist Party. So one can't be certain about it. But I should have thought that in a couple of years' time, the hand of Beijing in Hong Kong will be very present, omnipresent. The people of Hong Kong will regretfully, remorsefully, have resigned themselves to the way things are, and Taiwan will be the greater focus of attention. So that's a good, I think, way of circling back to the first question that we dealt with on timing and imminence, that we might look to Hong Kong not only as a sign of Beijing's intention, but also as something which will require a little bit of time, and therefore Taiwan ought to prepare itself for what's coming. The way I'd want to close this answer, however, is to remind ourselves that continuities and trends, including those emanating from 1949, are not inevitable. They are capable of disruption. And for all that we imagine Xi Jinping is in absolute control in Beijing and far beyond, we need to prepare for surprises, for the unexpected. China has delivered the unexpected on numerous occasions in its history. Let's not imagine that those phases and stages are gone. They might well be back. The subject perhaps of a talk on another occasion.
I think I think we have done all the questions. So it really just remains for me to thank Graham very, very much indeed for a really interesting and fascinating lecture. And of course, we shouldn't forget that this is a book launch. So it's time to go out and buy the book. So thank you very much to everyone for attending. And I hope you do join us for some of our other parts of our lecture series as they come up. And if you'd like to sign on to our list, our sort of attendees list, then just email me or email info@royalasiaticsociety.org, and we send out regular emails informing everyone of what's coming up. So thank you very much, and good evening, and I hope you all stay safe and well, and we remain in this sort of good, hopeful time with COVID receding behind us. Anyway, in London, that's the case. I know it's not so good for other people. So thank you very much indeed. And Graham, really, we're greatly honoured and really delighted that you were able to talk to us tonight. So thank you.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you so much to everyone.